under the vaulted dome of the Karen Military Academy, silence pressed against every wall, broken only by the faint hum of translation devices worn by the cadets. Rows of alien students sat upright, chitin gleaming, scales shifting, feathers rustling, each species representing a proud lineage of military tradition that stretched across centuries of interstellar conquest. Their uniforms shimmered in subtle hues of rank and heritage. They had all come here to prove themselves, to endure examinations so difficult that failure was considered an honor, survival a triumph. None of them believed that the human would last a single season. At the far end of the chamber, a lone figure stood among them, his uniform starkly plain compared to the ornate garb of the others. His shoulders were broad, his stance relaxed, his face unreadable beneath the harsh white light. He looked like he belonged on a battlefield, not in a classroom. His scars, subtle though they were, spoke more loudly than his stillness. The human marine, known only as Eric to most, seemed immune to the weight of expectation pressing down on the chamber. While the other cadets sat stiff with nerves, he leaned slightly on the desk, one hand drumming a steady rhythm as though he were waiting for something far less consequential than the exam of the year. The examiner, General Vera of the Karen, was a figure carved from discipline. His carapace gleamed of polished bronze, each movement measured and severe. He had presided over countless tests, reduced arrogant cadets to trembling husks with a single glare, and he regarded the human as little more than an amusing diversion. Humans were a young species by galactic standards, barely stepping into the interstellar stage. To Vera, their place in this academy was a bureaucratic mistake, a concession by the Council to mollify Earth's demands for equal representation. He intended to expose that mistake today. "Cadets," Vera began, his voice low yet resonant, carrying across the hall without need of amplification. "Today's examination will determine your comprehension of siege tactics. This is not merely theory. It is the study of patience, attrition, and inevitability. The art of grinding an enemy into surrender without granting them the mercy of swift defeat." His compound eyes swept over the room, and dozens of cadets stiffened under the weight of his gaze. Then those eyes settled on Eric, and a faint note of disdain colored his tone. "Human, you will begin." Dozens of alien necks craned toward him, eager for the humiliation they expected. Eric's fingers ceased their drumming, and he raised his head, meeting the general's gaze with calm amusement. He did not salute, did not tremble, did not avert his eyes as so many others had done. Instead, he straightened with lazy precision, as though every joint moved only because he permitted it. "You want a lecture on siege tactics?" His voice carried a sharp clarity, tinged with something that didn't quite fit the sterile air of the academy. A soldier's voice, unrefined, unpolished, but utterly assured. "All right, but before I start, you'll have to tell me something." Vera's mandibles clicked once in irritation. "Speak." Eric allowed himself the faintest of smiles, the kind that tugged at one corner of his mouth and seemed calculated to infuriate. "Do you want ancient, modern, or classified?" The silence that followed was palpable. 100 translation devices word struggled and confirmed the words. Ancient, modern, classified. The alien cadets exchanged confused glances. Siege tactics were a matter of logistics, not history, and certainly not secrecy. What kind of answer was this? Vera leaned forward, the ridges of his carapace catching the light. "Explain yourself, human." "Simple enough," Eric said, his voice still light, but edged with something that carried a darker weight. "We've been practicing siege warfare since long before we left our homeworld. Thousands of years of history. That's the ancient stuff. Modern, well, that's the wars your historians probably read about when Earth joined the Council. But classified?" He paused deliberately, scanning the room as if measuring each cadet's unease. "That's what I learned after I put on this uniform. That's what my instructors would rather I keep under wraps." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then whispers broke out among the cadets. Snatches of disbelief, derision, and a hint of unease. Some hissed through scaled throats that the human was posturing, trying to impress. Others muttered about how absurd it was to imagine a primitive world holding knowledge beyond their archives. But there were those whose feathers lay flat, whose spines stiffened, who recognized the tone of someone who was not exaggerating. Vera's voice sliced through the whispers. Choose whichever you believe will demonstrate the greatest knowledge. If your people truly have a history of sieges, show us. Eric's smirk faded, not into fear, but into focus. His posture shifted slightly, his casual air replaced with a precision that suggested this was no longer a game. He tapped the desk once more, a rhythmic beat that ceased as he inhaled. "All right," he said softly, the words carrying despite their quietness. "Let's start with ancient. That should be simple enough." The chamber seemed to contract, every cadet's attention pulled taut. Some leaned forward eagerly, expecting entertainment. Others braced for second-hand embarrassment. But beneath it all ran a current of tension none wanted to name. Eric rested his hands on the desk, gaze steady, voice cool. "You want to know about siege tactics? I'll tell you about the time my people fought a war that lasted 10 years over a single city. About fire that clung to water. About walls that stood for 1,000 years before they finally fell. You'll learn why patience is a weapon sharper than any blade." He let the words hang, the promise of stories older than their empires. Strategies rooted not in technology, but in the brutal, unrelenting will of survival. And in that moment, even the most skeptical cadets found themselves leaning in. The general's eyes narrowed, but he did not interrupt. He wanted to see where this led. He wanted to see whether the human was all bravado or whether there was something deeper lurking beneath the scars and the smirk. Eric waited a breath longer, then straightened his shoulders. "Ancient it is, then," he said. "Let's see how it compares to your archives." And with that, the examination truly began. Eric began without preamble, as though the centuries rested just beneath his tongue, waiting to be spoken aloud. His voice did not rise in performance, nor fall into the dryness of a lecture. It carried the cadence of memory, even though the events were far older than him, older than any human alive. The cadets leaned in despite themselves, their skepticism tempered by a curiosity they could not quite suppress. "The first siege you should know about," he said, eyes steady on the alien general, "was fought over pride as much as territory. A city called Troy. For 10 years, armies camped outside its walls. 10 years of skirmishes, attrition, and starvation. In the end, they didn't win by brute force. They won by deception, hiding warriors inside a wooden horse, offering it as tribute. The Trojans dragged it inside their gates, and by nightfall their city burned." A ripple moved through the chamber. Some cadets scoffed quietly at the absurdity of trusting such a gift, but others murmured in unease. The lesson was unmistakable. Siege did not end with walls alone. It ended with the collapse of trust, with trickery as sharp as any blade. Eric allowed the silence to stretch before continuing. But Troy was only the beginning. Centuries later, at a desert fortress called Masada, my people faced something different. Rebels barricaded themselves on a mountain, thousands of them. The enemy built ramps of stone and earth, dragging siege towers and engines up the incline under constant fire. The defenders knew their time was running out. When the walls finally fell, the soldiers found only silence. Nearly 1,000 men, women, and children had taken their own lives rather than kneel. Siege, you see, doesn't only test armies. It tests the soul. The cadets shifted uncomfortably. One with iridescent scales hissed under his breath, unable to mask his unease. Suicide en masse was alien to most of their cultures, unthinkable as a military outcome. Yet the humans spoke of it without flinching, as if it were a lesson drilled into the marrow of his people. And then Eric went on, his voice harder now. There was Constantinople, a city that endured for 1,000 years behind walls, so high and thick no army could break them. Generations tried. They hurled stones, fire, and steel at its defenses, and all failed. Until one day new weapons came. Cannons so massive they tore the walls apart. The unbreakable fell, not because the defenders lacked courage, but because time always births new tools, and every wall eventually meets its match. His words echoed, deliberate, heavy with meaning. The cadets understood. Siege was not merely a contest of force. It was inevitability itself, patient and merciless. General Vera's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable, but his silence was not born of disdain. He was listening. More importantly, he was calculating. Eric leaned back slightly, his posture never once losing its composure. "That's 3 examples," he said, almost conversational. 3 different centuries, 3 different lessons. Deception, willpower, innovation. Those are the bones of siege warfare. No matter how advanced you are, those truths don't change. One cadet, bristling with feathered crests, raised a hand without realizing it. "But these are ancient, crude. You lacked orbital bombardments, energy shields, planetary blockades. How can they possibly matter now?" Eric's eyes flicked to him, sharp and unblinking. "Because the heart of a siege isn't the weapons. It's the patience to wait, the cruelty to starve your enemy, the creativity to break what seems unbreakable. You think because you have fleets and plasma, the lessons no longer apply. You're wrong. All the technology in the galaxy won't change the truth that wars are decided by who can endure longer, and who can convince the other side that endurance is useless." The cadet faltered, crest feathers flattening in uncertainty. Eric's gaze swept the chamber once more, steady and merciless. "Your empires are young by some measures. Some of you don't even have 1,000 years of continuous history. Humanity's been breaking walls and starving cities since before we had iron. Siege isn't theory for us. It's instinct." A murmur rippled across the rows. Some voices hushed in disbelief, others hushed in dawning comprehension. The cadets had expected stories of primitive clubs against stone barricades, not centuries of refined brutality. They had not expected a soldier to recount them as though he were reciting his family tree. General Vera's mandibles twitched once, then stilled. "You have made your point human," he said, though the words were more measured than dismissive. "But I would hear how your kind views siege in the modern age. Surely your people have advanced since these stories of wood, stone, and desperation." Eric tilted his head slightly, the faintest glimmer of a smile flickering back across his face. "Modern," he echoed, as though tasting the word. "Oh yes, we've advanced. The ancient stuff was just the warm-up act." He rose from his seat with casual precision, standing tall among the seated cadets. For a moment, the chamber seemed smaller around him, as if he were not simply a single human but the weight of every army that had ever waited outside the gates of a city, every soldier who had ever endured hunger for the sake of victory. His eyes locked on the general. "If you thought ancient was unsettling," he said softly, "wait until you hear what we've done in the modern era." The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the entire academy held its breath. Some cadets stared at him in open disbelief, others with a creeping dread that they could not name. For the first time, even Vera did not rush to answer. He only gestured with a single deliberate motion, inviting the human to continue. Eric sat again, his smile fading into the same cool, unreadable calm that had unnerved them all from the beginning. He tapped the desk once, twice, then stilled his hand. "Very well," he said. "Let's talk about Stalingrad." The words dropped into the air like the first stones of a siege tower slamming into the earth, heavy and inevitable. And just like that, the cadets realized that the true examination had only begun. Eric's voice dropped lower, as though the name he had spoken carried its own gravity. "Stalingrad," he said, and the translation devices hesitated before settling on the word. "A city on Earth during the 20th century. 2 armies fought there, each unwilling to yield, each believing the city's fall would decide the fate of the world. It wasn't a siege of walls and castles. It was a siege of streets, of homes, of frozen rivers and shattered factories. Every block, every building became a fortress. Soldiers starved, froze, and bled in equal measure. Civilians scavenged bark from trees just to stay alive. Entire armies were ground down to bone and dust. The siege lasted months, and by the end, one side was broken not just in body, but in spirit." The cadets listened in rapt silence. Many had studied battles where fleets clashed in dazzling arcs of energy, where cities fell in minutes under plasma fire. None had imagined a war of months where human beings endured deprivation so total that hunger became a weapon sharper than steel. Eric leaned forward, his gaze fixed on no one and everyone. The lesson of Stalingrad wasn't just endurance. It was that you can turn a city into a trap. The defenders let their enemy inside and then bled them dry, inch by inch. The snow was red with it. The cold carried more death than the bullets. And when the end finally came, it wasn't technology that decided the victor. It was will, sheer relentless will. He let the words hang, and in the quiet that followed, some cadets shifted uncomfortably. A feathered one whispered, "That sounds like madness." Eric's eyes flicked toward him, hard as iron. Madness? Maybe. But victory often looks that way to those who've never starved for it. He tapped the desk again once, then twice. And Stalingrad wasn't the only modern siege. Sarajevo, decades later, another city trapped, cut off from supplies while snipers hunted civilians who dared step outside for water. Weeks turned to months, months to years. People endured under fire every day, and still they refused to break. Siege isn't just soldiers against soldiers. It's the slow strangling of a society until only bones remain. And yet, even then, humans resisted. The chamber was colder now, though no one had touched the temperature controls. The cadets, once so ready to laugh at primitive tales, sat rigid and silent. Siege was no longer an abstraction. It was hunger gnawing at the belly, the sound of footsteps on snow hiding the approach of death. General Vera shifted slightly in his seat, mandibles tight. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "You speak as if you lived these wars." Eric's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, gone as soon as it appeared. "I didn't live those battles, but my people carry them. We don't forget. We study them. We learn from every wound. Siege is in our bones." He paused, then tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "But that was modern. You asked me to choose, and I said ancient, modern, or classified. Maybe it's time we move past the history books." A ripple of unease traveled through the room. Classified, the word itself tasted dangerous in their ears, translated as restricted, forbidden, sealed. Even General Vera's compound eyes blinked once, slow and deliberate. "Classified," Vera repeated. "Do you claim you would expose military secrets in this chamber?" Eric's smile sharpened. "Not secrets. Lessons. You think humanity's history is frightening? You should see what we've done since joining the stars." He rose once more, deliberately slow, as if the motion itself were a declaration of intent. He clasped his hands behind his back, his stance that of a soldier giving a briefing to superiors, not a cadet taking an exam. "When Earth took to space, we discovered siege could be waged on a scale you've only begun to imagine. Entire planets cut off from supply lines. Orbiting fleets casting shadows that meant starvation for millions below. Satellites turned from tools of communication into nooses tightening around throats. Siege became more than walls and hunger. It became blockades measured in orbits, attrition that stretched across entire star systems." One cadet muttered, "That's just blockade warfare." Eric's gaze pinned him, sharp as a blade. Blockade is the word, but blockade is only a siege stretched wider. The principle is the same. Strangle the enemy. Deny them what they need. Crush their will until surrender feels like mercy. His tone darkened. "And that's just what you'd find in your archives. What's truly classified, what they don't teach you, is what happens when we stop waiting." He described in clipped precision operations that sounded more like nightmares than strategies. Stealth ships dropping nanite clouds into atmospheres, eating supply stores before armies even realized they were hungry. Targeted viral campaigns not against bodies but against food sources collapsing ecosystems until armies starved without a shot fired. AI-driven simulations predicting exactly when a population would riot under pressure, when a garrison would turn on its commander. Not all of it was said outright, but the implication dripped from every word. Humanity had not only studied siege warfare, they had perfected it, sharpened it, and hidden the blade. The cadets' faces betrayed their turmoil. Some were pale, others tense, a few wide-eyed with a dawning respect that bordered on fear. They had mocked the human as primitive. Now they understood. His people had practiced slow, patient brutality longer than their empires had existed, and in the quiet of classified archives, they had found ways to extend it beyond comprehension. General Vera's mandibles parted, then closed again. He studied Eric, and for the first time, his gaze carried not disdain, but the heavy weight of recognition. Eric finished softly, almost too softly. That's classified, the kind of thing that doesn't make it into public records. The kind of thing that makes you wonder if the walls around you are truly strong enough. Siege isn't about weapons. It's about inevitability. You can fight it, you can endure it, but you can never forget it. He lowered himself back into his seat, the faintest exhale slipping past his lips, as though he had just placed a weight on the table that none of them could lift. For a long time, the chamber was silent. Then Eric tilted his head, looked directly at the general, and asked with unsettling calm, "So do I pass?" No one laughed this time. No one whispered. The exam had turned into something else entirely, and every cadet in the room knew it. General Vera did not answer immediately. His compound eyes shifted, his mind clearly calculating, reassessing not just the human before him, but the species behind him. And in that hesitation, in that silence, the cadets realized the true conflict was no longer whether the Marine would pass the exam. It was what the galaxy would do when it finally understood what humanity had carried with it into the stars. The chamber seemed to breathe as one, a long exhale released after Eric's words. The silence that followed was neither empty nor comfortable. It was weighted, pressing into every cadet, into the scales, feathers, and carapaces of those who had come expecting an easy humiliation. They had heard an answer to an exam question, yes, but it was also a revelation, an unveiling of something older and more dangerous than their academies had prepared them to consider. General Vera did not move at first. His mandibles flexed once, then stilled, his gaze fixed on the human who had settled back into his seat as if the air weren't heavy with unspoken questions. For the first time since the exam began, the general's voice carried no contempt. You speak as though inevitability itself is your ally. Eric met his gaze evenly, the corners of his mouth almost softening into a smile. It usually is. That answer rippled through the chamber, though not a single cadet dared laugh. Some shifted, feathers lying flat, spines twitching with unease. Others avoided his eyes entirely, afraid of what they might see reflected in them. The myth of human primitiveness had been shattered, replaced by something far more difficult to categorize. They were no longer the young species on the periphery of galactic affairs. They were something older in spirit than their years in space suggested, something honed by hardship into a blade that no empire had yet tested. Vera leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the desk. You have described deception, endurance, innovation, inevitability. You have named victories carved from the bones of your own people. But do you know what unsettles me most, human? His compound eyes narrowed, facets glinting cold bronze. It is not that you know these things. It is how easily you spoke of them, as if you were not recounting horrors, but listing tools kept in your kit. Eric's expression did not change, but his voice sharpened. Because that's what they are. Tools. Lessons. Humanity doesn't run from its past. We carry it forward. We don't flinch at the things we've done, because pretending otherwise only ensures we'll repeat them. We remember so we can win the next time. The cadets shivered at the calm certainty in his tone. In their cultures, history was often polished, heroic, stripped of its ugliest truths. To hear a human embrace those truths without hesitation was to glimpse a species that refused to lie to itself about the cost of survival. Vera was silent for a long while, then finally straightened. His carapace creaked faintly as he rose to his full height. You were meant to be a curiosity, a reminder of why the Council entertains its younger members with symbolic gestures of equality. Instead, you have left me with a different conclusion. His voice rose, filling the hall with an authority no one could ignore. Humanity has mastered siege tactics longer than most of our empires have existed. You have earned the highest mark this examination can offer. The words fell like a gavel, final and unassailable. Yet instead of relief, the declaration left the cadets restless, their gazes darting between the general and the human. Some looked at Eric with newfound admiration, recognizing a strength they had never imagined. Others glanced away, unsettled, unwilling to admit that their prejudices had just been overturned. What had begun as an exam had become something larger, a glimpse of a predator they had never known hunted in their midst. Eric inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement that was not quite gratitude. He knew the general's words were more than praise. They were warning, wrapped in ceremony. His eyes lingered on the cadets around him, noting which ones stared at him with calculation, which ones with unease, and which ones with a spark of curiosity. They would remember this day long after the marks had been recorded. Inside, a different thought stirred. He had revealed more than he intended, allowed the curtain to slip far enough to show the outline of the blade beneath. Part of him wondered if it was a mistake, but another part, the soldier, the survivor, knew the truth. The galaxy needed to understand what humanity was before it underestimated them in a war that would not forgive naivety. Better they fear now than learn too late. The general dismissed the cadets, his voice carrying finality. Yet as the rows emptied, scales scraping against floors and feathers rustling in nervous clusters, Vera remained. He watched the human, his gaze heavy with something unspoken. When the chamber had emptied of all but the two of them, he spoke quietly, his tone stripped of performance. "If ever there is a galactic war," he said, each word deliberate, "your species will be the last to surrender." Eric's eyes held his, unflinching, and for the first time he smiled, not the smirk that taunted, not the grin that dared, but something sharper, colder, and far more honest. "We don't surrender, General. Not truly. We endure." The silence that followed was heavier than any applause could have been. Vera's mandibles flexed, then stilled once more, as if he had no reply worth speaking. Eric turned, his boots echoing against the chamber floor as he walked toward the exit. The vast doors loomed ahead, opening with a hydraulic hiss that carried into the hollow hall. For a heartbeat, he paused at the threshold, glancing back over his shoulder. His voice was calm, unhurried, but it carried with it the weight of inevitability. "Next time you ask for an answer," he said, "decide whether you want ancient, modern, or classified." And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that none of the cadets could fill. The general remained in the empty chamber, staring at the place where the human had stood. His claws drummed once against the desk, a rhythm of thought he had never before indulged during an exam. In that stillness, he recognized a truth that unsettled even him. The galaxy had welcomed humanity into its halls as equals, but they had not come as equals. They had come as something else entirely. The echo of the human's final words lingered in the cavernous room, not as a boast, but as a promise. Ancient, modern, classified, three choices, each a doorway into inevitability. And for the first time in centuries, General Vera felt the stirrings of unease, not for himself, but for the galaxy that had yet to grasp what humanity truly was. The corridor outside the examination hall stretched long and cold, its walls lined with banners bearing the insignias of empires older than Earth itself. Eric walked alone, his steps measured, his expression calm, yet every movement carried the weight of what had just transpired. Behind him, whispers already spread through the academy like sparks catching dry kindling. By tomorrow, every cadet would know the human had not merely passed the exam, he had redefined it. He reached a junction where the light dimmed into pale blues and silvers, the artificial daylight fading to simulate the academy's night cycle. A pair of alien cadets waited there, their uniforms neat, their faces taut with conflicting emotions. One was slender, scales shimmering in green and gold, eyes sharp and wary. The other was taller, feathered crests flaring slightly in agitation. They blocked his path, though not aggressively, more as if curiosity had planted them there, roots digging too deep to let them walk away. "You meant to frighten us," the feathered one said, his translator giving the words a clipped precision. "You recited horrors as if they were trophies." Eric stopped, tilting his head slightly, measuring them with that same unshakable calm. "I didn't come here to frighten anyone. I came to pass an exam." The scaled cadet hissed softly. "You call that an exam? You turned it into a threat." Eric's gaze held steady, unyielding. If you heard a threat, it wasn't in my words. It was in what those words revealed. History doesn't threaten. It warns. They fell silent for a beat, their postures uneasy. Neither could deny that the weight in his voice had not been exaggeration, but experience distilled into something sharp enough to cut. You think your people are stronger than ours, the feathered cadet pressed, though his tone betrayed uncertainty. Eric's answer was quiet, almost softer than the hum of the corridor lights. Not stronger, just older in ways that matter. Older in wounds, older in scars. The words settled between them like stones in water, ripples spreading outward. The cadets shifted, glancing at one another, then stepped aside, leaving his path clear. But their eyes followed him as he walked on, and Eric knew the unease would linger long after his footsteps faded. Further down the hall, the sound of clawed feet clicked against the polished floor. General Vera emerged from a side passage, his towering form unmistakable even in shadow. His compound eyes caught the light as he regarded Eric, mandibles tight with something not quite disapproval, not quite admiration. Human. The general's voice carried none of the ceremony it had held in the exam hall. Here it was stripped bare, direct. Eric halted, turning with the same deliberate calm that had unnerved the cadets. General, you understand what you've done, Vera said. It was not a question. Eric folded his arms loosely, shoulders relaxed. I answered your test. You reshaped it, Vera countered. His claws flexed once, scraping faintly against the metal wall. Cadets will not forget your words. They will carry them into their own commands, into their own wars. Some will fear you. Others will envy you. All will measure themselves differently because of what you revealed today. That was always the point, Eric replied evenly. Exams don't test knowledge. They reveal character. And maybe they reveal more than that. For a long moment, the general studied him. The hum of the corridor filled the silence, and distant voices echoed faintly down adjoining halls. Then Vera leaned closer, his voice dropping. You showed them more than lessons. You showed them inevitability that will ripple further than this academy. It will reach commanders, councils, perhaps even enemies. Eric's jaw tightened, just enough to betray thought beneath the mask of calm. He had known it, of course. The moment he chose to speak of classified doctrine, the moment he let those cadets glimpse the shadows of human warfare, he had shifted the balance. Secrets were dangerous things, and even fragments of them could stir fear in places that thrived on calculation. You wanted honesty, Eric said finally. You got it. What you do with it isn't my choice. Vera's mandibles flexed again, then stilled. His tone softened, though the weight never left it. You are either the most dangerous cadet to walk these halls or the most necessary. I cannot yet decide which. Eric offered no reply. His silence said enough. The general stepped past him, his carapace glinting bronze in the corridor light, his presence heavy even as he moved away. Yet his words lingered in the air like a blade suspended by a fraying thread. Eric resumed walking, though his thoughts moved far faster than his pace. He knew he had planted seeds of fear, of respect, of suspicion. The cadets who had heard him would carry those seeds back to their empires, and in time, those seeds might grow into strategies or into nightmares. He could not control that. Perhaps he had never intended to. Still, a question gnawed at the edges of his calm. Had he spoken too much? Revealed too clearly what humanity had buried under layers of secrecy? Or was this exactly what was needed? That the galaxy begin to understand who they were before the test of war arrived? He reached the end of the corridor, where a viewport opened onto the Academy's outer grounds. Beyond the glass, the stars spread endless and sharp, pinpricks of light scattered across velvet black. Somewhere among them lay Earth, small and fragile compared to the ancient empires represented here. Yet Eric's eyes did not hold fragility. They held inevitability, the same word he had spoken in the hall. Behind him, the Academy thrummed with whispers. Ahead of him, the stars promised conflicts yet to come. And in his mind, the echo of the exam lingered, not the questions but the answers. Ancient, modern, classified, each one a lesson, each one a warning. each one a doorway, yet unopened. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself as though preparing for another test, another siege of patience. The galaxy would learn, whether it learned willingly or through fire. That was not his choice to make. For now, he turned from a viewport and walked deeper into the Academy's night, his steps unhurried, his presence unshaken. And though the corridors emptied around him, the sense of inevitability remained, following him like a shadow that belonged not to a single man but to an entire species waiting at the edge of history. The summons came at dawn, though dawn was an artificial concept within the Academy's orbital station. Lights brightened in steady increments across the living quarters, cycling from deep indigo to pale gold, simulating a sunrise meant to soothe cadets into waking. For Eric, it carried no such comfort. He had not slept. The whisper of his own words from the exam still lingered in his thoughts, echoing louder than the silence of his quarters. Ancient, modern, classified, each choice had been a weapon, and he had loosed them into the galaxy with little hope of recalling them. The message appeared on his console, simple and stripped of ceremony. Asterisk, report to Council Chamber 12. Immediate, asterisk, no crest, no signature. Orders that spoke louder in their absence of detail. When he arrived, the chamber was not filled with cadets or examiners but with generals, figures of legend in their respective empires, their uniforms gleaming with honors from wars Eric had only studied in briefings. Some bore scars visible even through ceremonial armor. Others radiated the sort of cold authority that needed no scars to be understood. General Vera stood among them, his carapace catching the chamber's stark light, but he was not in command here. He stood to the side, his mandibles drawn tight, watching. Eric entered without falter, his posture straight, his face composed. Yet, beneath the calm, every instinct sharpened to a knife's edge. These were not examiners. This was a tribunal. The presiding officer, a broad-shouldered Keth with skin like polished obsidian, spoke first. Human, you sit before us accused of revealing classified doctrine to unauthorized audiences. You will answer for the consequences of your performance. The word was spat with disdain, yet Eric did not flinch. His gaze moved from one general to the next, reading them as if they were battlefields. The suspicion, the restrained anger, and, buried in a few, the reluctant flicker of respect. I answered a question put to me in exam, Eric said evenly. I was asked about siege tactics. I provided an answer. You offered more than answers, another general interjected, her scales glimmering like shards of amethyst. You offered threats disguised as history. You boasted of human capacity for destruction. Eric's voice remained calm, though his chest tightened with the weight of what was being implied. I did not boast. I stated facts. Facts that might matter when wars you have not yet imagined arrive at your borders. A ripple of discontent moved through the chamber. Some generals leaned forward, others exchanged glances, as though his words carried too much weight to ignore yet too much danger to acknowledge. General Vera finally spoke, his voice carrying both steel and restraint. You speak as if inevitability is truth, that wars yet to come are certain. Is this what you mean to teach our cadets? That doom is assured? Eric turned his gaze on him, steady and unyielding. I mean to teach them that siege is not merely a tactic. It is a reality. You may choose to ignore it, but the universe will not. The presiding officer's mandibles clicked sharply, silencing the chamber. And yet you broke trust. You bared secrets not meant to be shared. Tell me, human, was that arrogance? Or was it design? The question hung in the air like a blade. Eric let the silence stretch before answering, choosing words as carefully as weapons. Neither. It was necessity. Your cadets were asked to imagine siege. They gave answers rooted in theory. I gave them truth, not because I wished to frighten them, but because one day their survival may depend on understanding what truth looks like. If you call that arrogance, then so be it, but do not call it a lie. The chamber fell still. Some generals shifted, uncomfortable not with his defiance, but with the shadow of recognition behind his words. They knew, as he did, that truth was the one thing hardest to contain. The Keth presiding officer leaned back, his obsidian features unreadable. Do you understand what you've unleashed, human? Fear spreads faster than fact. Empires hear whispers before they hear warnings. Already there are reports from the cadet halls, rumors of weapons, of wars, of humanity as a storm waiting to break. Eric's jaw tightened, though his voice did not rise. Then let them whisper. Better they fear what is true than underestimate what is real. That answer settled over the chamber like smoke. Heavy, suffocating, yet undeniable. General Vera broke the silence once more, his tone quieter now, though not softer. You've set a course, Eric, when you cannot walk back. You have become, whether you wished it or not, the measure by which humanity will be judged. That is not an honor. It is a burden, one that may outlast you. For the first time, a flicker of something unguarded crossed Eric's face, not doubt, but recognition. He had carried burdens before, on worlds scarred by conflicts the galaxy had never seen. This one, though, was different. It was heavier because it was not only his. It was humanity's. The presiding officer gestured sharply, signaling the end of proceedings. We will deliberate. Until then, you remain confined to the academy grounds. Do not mistake our leniency for forgiveness. You are watched, human. Remember that. Eric bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but acknowledgement, and turned to leave. As he passed, the general's eyes followed him, weighing him not as a cadet, but as a threat, a warning, perhaps even as a weapon. Outside the chamber, the corridor stretched long and silent. Eric walked it alone, his footsteps echoing faintly against the steel. The whispers had already spread, just as the presiding officer had said. Cadets he passed fell silent, their gazes sharp with curiosity, fear, or awe. None dared speak to him. None dared stand in his way. He returned to his quarters, but rest did not come. Instead, he stood at the viewport, watching the stars wheel endlessly beyond the glass. Somewhere among them lay Earth, distant yet unavoidable, its history now carried in his words, its future already entwined with the fates of empires that might never have known existed. He thought of the exam, of the question that had set all of this in motion. Siege tactics, ancient, modern, classified. What he had given them was not only an answer, it was a choice that none of them yet understood, but one day would. Behind him, the academy pulsed with unease. Before him, the stars stretched wide, indifferent, waiting. And within him, the burden settled like armor. Heavy, unrelenting, necessary. The future had already shifted, whether it broke into war or into something unimagined. Eric knew he had become its harbinger, and the galaxy would not soon forget.